Before I forget, Revelation 22 notes are on the back table. They're hole punched and ready to go. I've also emailed them out to everybody. So we have both Revelation 21 and 22 available for everybody who needs it. Last week we began Revelation 21 as John is seeing this home in heaven that has been prepared, that is waiting for the faithful. John's given a glimpse of what this place looks like. And remember, the first heaven and the first earth had passed away and there was no more sea. And we discussed the fact that we're not talking about a new physical creation, that he's not going to recreate the universe and recreate a physical earth and physical sun and all of that. This is a spiritual place. The fact that there's no more sea harkens back to Revelation 4, it seems, where the sea kind of represents the separation between man and God. Well, no longer will there be separation between the faithful and the Lord. Now we will be with the Lord forever. And in verse 2, he sees the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven. And several times it's referenced the fact that John sees this heavenly city coming down. But not once does the heavenly city land on earth. Okay, it's just kind of coming down out of the clouds, so to speak, and then being given to John to glimpse, to look at, to examine. Never once is it said to stay. It then goes back or sends back up into heaven is the idea. And so we see in verse 3 and 4, and as we talked a little bit about last week, the promises of God that we see from verses 3 on through verse 8, and even some into the latter end of the chapter, the promises of what this place is going to be like, how that he will be our God and we will be his people. In fact, it's almost a direct quote from Ezekiel chapter 37 and in verse 27. The fact that he's going to dwell with us, that dwelling place, that tabernacle, the place where God's presence dwelt. Remember, the glory of his presence shone through the tabernacle. In fact, it was so bright when Moses was up on Mount Sinai that his face continued to shine after he came down off the mountain. He had to wear a veil to cover his face. Heaven will be a place with no death, no sorrow, no crying, no pain. We find in verse 4, the former things, or the first things, have passed away. That term former things, the term former there is the exact same term as verse 1, the first heaven and the first earth, exact same term. It's the reference to those physical things. These physical things have passed away. That's why there's not going to be any more pain or suffering or crime, because there's not going to be any more flesh and blood. That place is no longer going to exist. This realm of the physical isn't going to exist anymore. And so in verse 5, he who sat on the throne, and again, whether you specifically take this as the Father or as Jesus himself, this is God, the three in one, God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit together as deity, making this statement, because Jesus himself repeats this in chapter 22. But he says, behold, I make all things new. And that phrase, make all things new, remember we looked at that a little bit last week with regard to the connection that has to the spiritual and the making of all things new spiritually. 2 Corinthians in chapter 5, verses 14 on through verse 17, Paul, he also uses that phrase, how that he has made all things new. Those who are in Christ are a new creation. But that speaks not to the flesh, it doesn't make the flesh new, it makes the spirit new, the soul new. And so both places in the New Testament where this phrase is used is pertaining to spiritual nature. It has nothing to do with the physical. And so then in verse 6, he says, it is done. I'm the Alpha, the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give the fountain of the water of life freely to him who thirsts. The beginning and the end, Alpha and Omega, certainly speaks to creation. And the fact that God, they, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, created all things. And then they will bring an end to all creation. And certainly, therefore, God being the Alpha and the Omega, and certainly Jesus, as he references this in chapter 22 as well, that he's the beginning and the end, not only of all things and all creation, but he's the beginning and end of our salvation. Verse 7, he who overcomes shall inherit all things. I will be his God, and he shall be my son. In context, what are the all things? Does that mean I'll inherit tons of money, all the cars I want, all the houses I want?
All the spiritual things he's been describing.
Spiritual things. Okay, all things doesn't mean I get to just open that up and define whatever I want to from that. It's within our context of chapter 21. We're talking about these spiritual promises Therefore, he who overcomes, just as to the seven churches of Asia, every single one of them was given a promise: to he who overcomes, I will give. Well, they shall inherit all things. And this speaks back a little bit as well to what Jesus says in the Beatitudes. Blessed are blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth, I think is what the meek inherit the earth. And that speaks to not necessarily inheriting the physical earth, but the sense of overcoming the earth and inheriting a home waiting for them. Verse 8, the cowardly, the unbelieving, the abominable, murderers, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars shall have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone, which is the second death. And we were introduced to the idea of the second death back in chapter 20, and how that this second death, remember we discussed this in context to the 1,000 years, and how that this is a state of being those who are faithful unto the Lord and now are reserved for heaven, versus those who are outside of that promise, that reservation, that home in heaven, who don't have that. But notice the first resurrection, verse 5, but then in verse 6, blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power. Well, later on in chapter 20, at the very end, this is defined as that lake of fire, verse 14 and 15. Death and Hades were cast in the lake of fire. This is the second death. So then the second death speaks to that judgment, that final judgment, that ultimate judgment, where souls will be sentenced to torment who did not do as God told them to do. Thus, when he says in verse 8, this list of things, and again, we have many lists in the New Testament of individuals who will not inherit the kingdom of God, or who will have their part in the lake of fire. These are not necessarily comprehensive lists, meaning they're not full lists of every possible thing or every possible practice or sin that can be involved. But this is one such list. In fact, there's going to be another in chapter 22. We talk about the cowardly and how that's kind of a weird translation of that term. It means to be fearful or to have dread. Okay, those who dread. Those who understand that they're not doing what's right. They're not really focused on that right now. But there's this deep abiding dread. They know that they're not doing what's right. Then he contrasts that with unbelieving. Okay, there's those who know, but they just don't care. But then there's those who don't believe at all. And then abominable, murderers, and so forth. They have their part in the lake which burns with fire and brimstone. Any thoughts on verse 8?
It's cowardly and fearful.
Yeah, well, and that's why I say cowardly. It suggests an attribute regarding people that they're just kind of, they're afraid of things. Okay, and the term itself carries with it the sense of dread. Now, whether you apply that dread, I apply that dread specifically to the understanding of what's coming. Now, it could also be those who are cowardly or dreadful in the sense of maybe not standing for the truth. I mean, you could apply it that way, but
That's what I would.
yeah, that doesn't seem like verse 8 is taking into account any individual who is a Christian but is afraid. But you certainly could apply it that way. But I mean, there's the sense of that dreadful, those who have this sense of dread, seems like there's a connection there to what's coming. But like you say, it could also be those cowardly Christians who refuse to stand for the truth. It could also include them as well. And certainly both are applicable.
Could there be an immediate contrast, verse 7, one who overcomes everything that would take to overcome?
Sure.
But the cowardly one who backs off, doesn't.
Sure. Yeah, you could connect the end of the end of verse 7 to that very beginning of verse 8 and kind of combine them there, and then the contrast. He kind of here's those who are overcoming, then here's those Christians who refuse to overcome or won't overcome because they're afraid, and then he goes on to unbelieving, kind of a escalation type of thing. You could look at it that way. Yeah. That's probably why the New King James translates it cowardly. It's probably that take that they're taking on that. All right. So then in verse 9. So it's interesting because the angel, remember, we've had these 7 angels with the 7 bowls of the 7 plagues, and they've kind of been in the background here this whole time. And every now and then they'll be referenced, how one of them will speak or one of them will do something. But it's always been that imagery, because that's the last set of imagery we were left with. Remember, we had the seals being broken, we had the trumpets being blown, and now we've had these 7 angels, the 7 bowls of wrath. Okay, the ultimate judgment of God upon the Roman Empire, how that he was going to bring it to heel and punish it for this enforcement of idolatry and persecution of his people. Well, here in verse 9, one of the 7 angels, again, it doesn't matter which one, and it's not literal anyway in that sense. This is symbolic. It's imagery being given to John, how that one of these 7 bowls, or one of these angels filled with 7 bowls and 7 last plagues came and he talked to me. And he says, "Come, I will show you the bride, the Lamb's wife." And notice in verse 10, what's being described here is a place. And this place, the way it's described and how it's made and the type of valuables that are being referred to emphasizes the precious nature of this place. "He carried me away in the Spirit to a great and high mountain and showed me the great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God." Notice it's still descending. It's not on earth. It's just there in the clouds. It's there in the sky. He's taken him to this great high place that he can see it all. And then in verse 11, it has the glory of God. Her light was like the most precious stone, like a jasper stone, clear as crystal. Jasper apparently seems to be another name for what we would call a diamond. Diamond, especially perfect diamonds, that they have great clarity, very clear, very bright, certainly very valuable. As they were in this time, we consider diamonds very valuable today. Her light, the light was as of a diamond. Okay, like crystal, how beautiful the light was. And verse 12, also she had a great and high wall with 12 gates, and 12 angels at the gates, and names written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. So in this city, you have this wall. Now, what's the wall? What were walls meant to do in New Testament times, in Old Testament times? Keep things out. Okay, it was meant for protection. It was meant to keep people safe. And so this wall, again, is symbolic, because in heaven, is there going to be any fear of attack? No. But it's symbolic. It's representation of that safety that exists. It's a great and high wall, and it has 12 gates. And what we're going to find, verse 13, is that on all 4 sides, there's 3 gates on each side, equaling up to 12. There's an angel at each gate, suggesting what? A guard. Remember what happened in Genesis chapter 3 after God cast Adam and Eve out of the garden? What did he do with regard to the garden and the tree of life? He put cherubim to guard the way to the tree of life so that no man could re-enter the Garden of Eden and take of the tree of life. And so and there's more interesting stuff, especially in chapter 22, that might also be imagery back to Genesis as well. But the idea of having that guard there, someone who is making sure that no one who's not supposed to be here, they're not allowed to get in. You know how a lot of people refer to the pearly gates, and then at the pearly gates, though, especially in the Catholic mind, Catholic literature, imagery, memes, jokes, things like that, who's always there? Peter. Okay, Peter's at the gate, right? In fact, what's the name of that song, 16 Tons? Is that the name of the song? Yep. Peter, don't take me because I still owe my soul to the company store. The idea there is that Peter's making sure that whoever gets in, and that harkens back to the misunderstanding of what Jesus said, that upon Peter I will build my church, and that's not what Jesus said. It was upon the rock that he is the Christ, the Son of God, talking about himself. I am the Messiah, the Son of God. I will build my church on that, not on Peter. But that's why sometimes you see that imagery there. But what's being described here isn't that there are apostles at the gates that are determining who gets to go in and who doesn't. Jesus makes specific and makes that determination. But we have this imagery of this protection, this place where no one is allowed to enter who doesn't belong there. And then on the gates, the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. We talked before about literal versus figurative or symbolic Israel, and how that certainly there was a sense in which those Jews who were willing to follow the Messiah, they certainly will have their home in heaven if they follow faithfully the Lord, just as the Gentiles who follow faithfully will. But physical Israel has absolutely no bearing whatsoever anymore as far as God is concerned. There is no sense of genealogy or importance behind who you descended from, whether you descended physically from Abraham or not. Paul in Galatians 3 and 4, he says that we are the seed of Abraham if we are in faith, children of God through Christ. So we are Abraham's seed, regardless of whether we're physically of his lineage or not. And so the understanding then of these 12 tribes of the children of Israel, certainly there's the representation here of all of those who were faithful under the Mosaical law, the patriarchal law, and so forth. Remember, we talked about this before with the 24 elders, and how that there were 24 thrones surrounding the throne of God in heaven in Revelation 4, and how that you have 12 being half of 24, you have the 12 tribes, you have the 12 apostles, and it seems to represent this fullness of the dispensations of God. All those who were faithful, going all the way back to Abel, all the way through Abraham and Noah, and then Abraham, and then certainly Moses and David under the Mosaical law. Because in verse 14, notice what else we have. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. So on the gates were written the names of the 12 tribes, and on the foundations were the 12 apostles, which seems to signify the fullness of all the people of God throughout from the beginning of time on. All those who were faithful to the Lord, who died faithful to the Lord, whatever law in which they were under, this is kind of this home that represents this home that they have. All will be in the same place. Now it's really interesting as we go through this. The Mormon Church, or the Church of Latter-day Saints, they believe in different levels of heaven. Okay, they also believe in different levels of hell, but specifically the different levels of heaven. And even Elizabeth had a friend who grew up Mormon, and even she was confused because the Mormon Church taught her that she would be with all of her family forever. But she said, but I know for a fact my brother's, he's not really a practicing Mormon, so he's going to be like maybe on the last level, the bottom level. So how are we all going to be together forever if we're all in separate levels? And it didn't make any sense to her. And it doesn't make any sense when it comes to Scripture either. Because what is being described here? Are we describing a city? Throughout this description, do we find different districts where you have the rich people? They're the really holy, righteous people. And then you have kind of the poor side, the ghetto part, where it's just these people were barely good enough to get into heaven. Do you see anything like that? No. This is a place where people walk and exist freely. And so, verse 15, he who talked with me had a gold reed to measure the city, its gates, and its wall. Now, this kind of harkens back to an earlier chapter where there was a reed given to John to measure the temple and the courtyard. And it's really interesting, the idea of the measuring of this temple and the specifics that are involved. You know, he could have just as easily, it could have been revealed to him just as easily that, hey, this is a really big place. That's not what God does. That's not what John does. He specifies exactly what this is what the links are. Anything through verse 15. Verse 16 says, the city is laid out as a square. Its length is as great as its breadth. He measured the city with the reed, 12,000 furlongs. Its length, breadth, and height are equal. Now, 12,000 furlongs, if you equate that to 144 cubits, which some of your translations does that conversion already, okay, 12,000 furlongs equates to 144 cubits. Well, 144 cubits is 216 feet. Or, I'm sorry, this is the wall. The wall, verse 17. 144 cubits, according to the measure of man that is an angel. A cubit is 18 inches. It was measured from the end of your middle finger to the end of your elbow. That made it really easy for people to measure things. And obviously not every person's length of their elbow or forearm is the same. But generally speaking, it was about 18 inches. And so those 144 cubits equated to about 216 feet thick is what's being described. It's the thickness of the wall. Now I want you to think about that. The walls of Jericho, which were considered to be some of the strongest walls of antiquity. I mean, even still today, they're discovering and doing more archaeology at Jericho, discovering just how strong these walls were, how impressive they were. They had multiple tiers of walls, and each one of those walls were about 20 to 30 feet thick. What's being described here is 216 feet thick. All right, is anybody getting through that wall?
No.
No. And that's really what the point is. Although the 144 cubits, where else have we seen the number 144 before? 144,000. And the 144,000, remember when we talked about the 144,000 being the faithful of God that are on earth at any given time, not that they're literally that many people, but it just is a number that is representative. It's this, whether you break it down as this 144 is 12 times 12, 144,000 is 12,000, or 1,200 times 1,200, or if you break it down as many of the commentaries do, 12 times
Tribes of Israel.
yeah, 12 times 12, which is 144, representing the 12 tribes of Israel and the 12 apostles. So regardless of how you go with that, it's kind of an interesting representation of the faithful of God. So going back to the city, though, and that's what we were just talking about, the 12,000 furlongs, equals about 1,500 miles. 1,500 miles along one side. So that means it's 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles. Notice it says that it's laid out as a square. Its length, its breadth, and its height are all the same. So we're talking about 1,500 miles long, wide, and tall. What's that describing? It's a cube. Okay, it's a perfect cube for one thing. But then the other thing, I want you to put that into perspective, just how big that is. That is 3 billion cubic miles. And the statement that you have from many who are expecting a physical city to come down out of heaven and be placed in Palestine, would a city that is 3 billion cubic miles, 15 miles wide, 15 miles long, fit in Palestine? No, not even kind of. And so again, they pick and choose what they want to take literally and what they want to take figuratively instead of taking it all symbolically as it should be. They say, oh, this is a physical thing that's going to come down, it's going to be placed where Jerusalem is now. It's going to replace Jerusalem. The old Jerusalem is going to replace with New Jerusalem. And that's not at all what's being described. It's being described basically when you have 3 billion cubic miles, how many people can fit there? How many people can exist in heaven? As many people as who are faithful to the Lord can go there. This is why Jesus says in John 14 that he's going to prepare a place. In his Father's house are many mansions or many rooms, but the term room there, it's almost like in my Father's estate, there are many houses, different places where people can live. And the idea there is it's as big as it needs to be. Because again, space is relative to a physical realm. In the spiritual realm, that doesn't really equate properly. And so to be able to comprehend that, this is why this is being described to John that way. Yeah, no.
If this were literal, can you imagine how long John sat and waited while the guy took a yardstick, a measuring stick?
That's a great
1,500
point.
miles to measure it out.
That's a great point. Yeah, he takes a reed to measure this out. How long would it take to measure 1,500, just 1,500 miles on one side? That's impressive. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Great point. All right, anything else through that? All right. Yeah, so this is the part I was trying to think of earlier. It seems to be a combination of number 12, which is the number that represents spiritual Israel, and 1,000, the state of those that are saved. Remember the previous chapter, we talked about what was called the 1,000-year reign, but we talked about the fact that it's not so much time as it is a state of being. It's a state of being in approval before God. Those who are reigning with Jesus, we're going to see in chapter 22, speaks directly to those who are faithful unto death. So this kind of combination of this 12 and 1,000 and how all those kind of things are symbolic of different imagery, different ideas. And it's basically meant to convey that there's room for all who obey the Lord. And when I think about there being room in heaven, there was an episode of Everybody Loves Raymond where he's trying to talk to his daughter about death and about going to heaven. And she's like, well, I want to go now. He's like, well, you can't go. Well, why not? Because, well, there's just not room in there right now for you. Why? And he said, because of the heavenly congestion. There's just too much congestion in heaven. We've got to kind of clear it out first, and then you can go. And so he was trying to make the point. He doesn't want his daughter to die and go to heaven, but she wants to go there because it's a beautiful place. Well, this speaks directly to the idea that there is no congestion. There's no limitation to movement in any way, as what's being described here. All right, thoughts or comments to that? All right. We see verse 18, the construction of its wall was of jasper. The city was pure gold like clear glass. Now, is gold clear? No. But for glass to be clear, what do you have to do to it? Have to polish it. Okay, and that seems to be what's being specifically described regarding the gold, that it was so bright and so clean that it was polished just like clear glass is. It's not that this gold is transparent or see-through. It's just that it was so perfect. And then the wall was diamond, okay, the jasper again. So picture this wall of pure diamond. But I want you to imagine something else too. If a wall is pure diamond, what are you able to do? Even 216-foot thick wall, you can see through it. And what does that suggest? What does that say about this place of heaven?
Purity.
Huh?
Purity.
Purity. It speaks to the idea of purity, holiness, righteousness. All those attributes certainly would be applicable to that. But also the sense in which there is nothing that is restricting us. Okay, the idea of a wall, in addition to protection, if you lived right on the wall or next to the wall or whatever, there's a sense of this is the limit. This is as far as we can go. Okay, we're restricted to safety within these walls. If I go outside these walls, I'm not safe anymore. The idea of it being completely see-through, completely clear, the whole idea is there is no restriction. There is no limit to this city. It is perfect. Then in verse 19, the foundations of the wall of the city were adorned with all kinds of precious stones. The first foundation was jasper, there's your diamond. The second, sapphire. The third, chalcedony. And some of these, they're very specific, and I think that's really interesting because some of these were actually imported and highly valuable. Some of them, they're still trying to figure out exactly, okay, this is the term they use for it. What term do we use for it? And they're still trying to figure out exactly what was what. But you have emerald, you have sardonyx, you had sardius, you had chrysolite, beryl, topaz, chrysoprase, that one, and then jacinth and amethyst. But again, the specifics regarding these speak to that these are not found in Palestine, not all of them. Okay, you can't naturally find these things. These have to be imported from all over the world. And I think that's really interesting that they're so valuable and so precious even today. Many of these things are still considered to be luxury, highly luxury items, very expensive items. And that, again, speaks to the nature of this precious place, this beautiful, not expensive in the sense of how much money God spent building it. It's the sense of how treasured it is. All right, any thoughts to that?
He's talking about the clear walls. When you go back and you look at the rich man and Lazarus, he could see.
He could see.
Lazarus, and think of the agony that alone would give you.
Yeah, it kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? You know, when the rich man, if those of you who can't hear the frog up here talking, when the rich man and Lazarus, when you had that whether you're going to call it a parable or whatnot, Jesus speaks regarding the state of Hades, this realm of the dead. You have this place of paradise, you have this place of torment. And the rich man could see Lazarus laying on Abraham's bosom. He was able to see that, to perceive Abraham there. And it makes you wonder the way in which this is described, this lake of fire, but then out of the same token, you have those who are outside the city. So those who are outside the city, they're part of this lake of fire. Will they be able to see the faithful enjoying this home in heaven? I don't know. But as Dwayne pointed out, that would just multiply tenfold the agony that they're suffering. Not only the fact that they're in this place of fire and torment forever, but they're seeing what they could have had. They're seeing what they could have enjoyed, but because they refused to obey or refused to be faithful, they didn't. Can you imagine how much worse? I mean, can you imagine hell being bad enough, but then having to see what you could have had and not having it? First, Gil.
If I'm a
Christian at this time and I get this scroll from John. So we've gone through all this stuff about all the destruction that's going to happen. Even though I don't like that destruction, when I get to all these measurements, I'm finally understanding, boy, I serve a God that has a plan. And
Yeah.
there's a process that he has us go through. He doesn't miss details. He's got all this figured out.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only is it a plan, but it's a place that is prepared. And remember, Hebrew writer says in Hebrews 12, the saints are reserved in heaven. Okay, there is this place, you could call it a house, a mansion, whatever, that has our name reserved on it, which is to say, our name's written in the book of life if we're faithful and being faithful unto the Lord. And so you're absolutely right. God, and this plan isn't just something he came up with on the spur of the moment. It was before he even created us. And someone, asked me last week, well, why would God create us to start with if he knew we were going to fall and knew we were going to have to go through all of this? I don't have that answer. I don't know why God deemed it necessary to create us in the first place. He didn't have to do that, but he chose to. Whether or not that has something to do with, wanting to be able to share this great heavenly place that he had with something that he created, I don't know. And maybe we'll get to know in heaven if God allows us to know that. But what we do know is that God knew ahead of time what was going to happen, and that there had to be a plan in place to provide a means of salvation for his creation. And that's exactly what he did. And it's been in place ever since. Ben?
I was thinking back to the clear walls also about walls are for protection. Someone can see in. There's no fear of invasion. There's
Right.
no fear of anybody being able to breach it.
Right.
Anything like that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it certainly speaks to a sense of openness, a sense of transparency. God, Peter tells us we've been given all things that pertain to life and godliness. Has God kept anything back that we need to know about how to get to heaven, about how to save our souls? Has he kept back anything? No. Now, has he kept back information regarding the universe? Regarding the exact details, certainly, of what heaven's going to be like from a spiritual perspective? Yes. There are things that we don't know, how God did this and how God did that. That's part of the reason why he asked Job, Job, where were you when I did this and I did that? Surely, with your wisdom, you must know and be able to answer me these things. Well, you and I can't answer those things any more than Job could. We have no need to, and that's what Job had to learn, is that I can't be asking, why did you let this happen to me, or was it wise to allow these things to happen to me? I don't need to know why they did, only that you expect me to be faithful despite whatever I'm facing, good or bad. And that's what Job learned. He didn't need to know. And unfortunately, we have so many, and even in the back of our own minds, I'm sure there's questions we wish we could ask, questions we wish we had the answers to. Sometimes we sing the song, farther along we'll know all about it, farther along we'll understand why. And I always make a mental note if we sing that hymn to remind myself that if God allows me to. Because there's no guarantee, even once we get to heaven, we're even going to care at that point about where did Cain get his wife. It's not going to matter at that point, but maybe we could ask God and maybe he'll answer, but at that point it's not going to matter anyway. What were the dinosaurs actually like? Maybe we'll care and we can ask and maybe God will tell us. But in the end, the whole focus is on getting to heaven, and that's why God has given us what we need to get there. There's a whole lot of other stuff that we wish we could know, maybe, but we don't need to know, and that should not keep us from pursuing the Lord, because he's given us what we need to know to get to heaven. Thoughts or comments to that? Yes, sir.
Just a quick note back to the first couple of verses, but this is a vision John is seeing of the city coming down out of heaven.
Out of heaven.
This isn't necessarily the entirety of heaven even being described.
Yeah, you're right.
Per se, it may be representative of a glimpse of what heaven is like.
Right.
But this is the new heaven, the new Jerusalem, is what he's being allowed to see in a vision.
Right.
It's not a literal statement, as I said, but it's coming down out of heaven.
Right. You're
It's
absolutely
not-
right.
This isn't heaven that he's seen.
Yeah, you're right. And there may be far more, in fact, I would venture to say there absolutely is far more to all of this than even what we can get out of the imagery and the symbolism being mentioned here. Yes, there's the holiness, the purity, all of that, but there is absolutely far more to heaven than even what John's able to ascertain from what he's being seen or being shown. And Joe's absolutely right. This is not the expanse of heaven being shown here. This is the place that God has prepared for us, at least in the symbolism of this is why you should want to be there. This is why you should want to go there. You're absolutely right.
I think
Yes.
tied in with that is, we often read about those Jesus we talked to had trouble. He's teaching spiritual, they're relating to physical, like
Yep.
food or whatever. Same thing, you read words like city and this, and our mind immediately jumps to what that picture is or means to us.
Right.
But as Joe's pointing out, I mean, this is all a vision
Yeah.
of something.
Yeah, this is
spiritual.
not literal. This isn't a physical thing. You're absolutely right. And that goes back to the nature of trying to explain spiritual things to people whose only frame of reference is flesh and blood. And it really kind of gives you a perspective and appreciation for the parables that Jesus taught. Right? Jesus took physical components, things that we know, or at least especially they did back in the New Testament times, the parable of the sower, for instance, things that they dealt with all the time, and he made spiritual applications from that to give an understanding regarding principles by which we get to heaven. But actually describing heaven, describing what this place is like to physical people who have no frame of reference, that's impossible. And that's why we have it given to us in this way. But why in this vision? Why not just tell us? Because you can't understand, unless you're actually there, you can't understand what this is like. And so it kind of brings up this appreciation for the teaching of the New Testament, especially the parables, where they take something physical and then turn it and make a spiritual application for it. Yeah. Verse 21, the 12 gates were 12 pearls. Each individual gate was of one pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold like transparent glass. Again, that transparent glass speaks to what seems to speak to the polish of that gold. Now, some people say streets of gold. This says street. It doesn't really matter because we're going to see it's laid out, as I mentioned, it's laid out in a square, like a grid almost. Streets, I'm sure there were multiple paths. It doesn't really matter. But the idea is that it's interesting that this pearl, each gate was made of one pearl. In my head, I picture a single pearl, great big huge pearl, split down the middle, and then it opens and shuts like that. Now, how that would work, I've never seen a pearl that big, but that's the point. Something so precious, something so valuable, and they made a gate into it, or out of it, is the idea here. And then verse 22, I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. Now, it's really interesting because when you start talking about like Jerusalem, and even going back before the temple was built in Jerusalem, the tabernacle, that was the place where the Ark of the Covenant was, or especially in the most holy, where the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, and certainly outside of the holy place, you had the altar and all of the pieces of equipment that were part of the tabernacle. But it was all for the purpose of servicing Jehovah, primarily for the sins of the people, on the Day of Atonement. In order to do that, the high priest had to purify himself, then he had to offer sacrifice for the sins of the people. God came in, he sat on the mercy seat, but only for that day, only for that sacrifice that was made. Why is there no need for a temple? Or a tabernacle?
Because that's the place where God dwells. This is now the new place where God dwells.
Yeah, God is, he doesn't have to, and of course he never dwelt in temples made with hands permanently, not in that sense. But the idea here is that if the temple represents where God would go, especially on the Day of Atonement, that idea of sitting on the mercy seat, here there's no need for that anymore. Because there's no more separation between God and his people, those people who have been faithful to him. The God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. And our worship and our praise and all of that is all together as one population of the people of God in heaven, praising Jehovah who's there, right there in front of us. And that's why there's no need for a temple or a tabernacle or an altar in that sense. Verse 23, the city had no need of the sun or of the moon to shine in it, for the glory of God illuminated it. The Lamb is its light. We also see this come up in chapter 22 as well. how that there's no night there and no need for any light, no need for a lamp, because the Lord and the Lamb are its light. And that certainly speaks to the glory of God. It kind of harkens back, it kind of brings to mind things like Mount Sinai and Moses and how his face was shining and so forth. It certainly speaks to that glory. But again, this is, light in the sense of a physical sense. We understand that. This is speaking directly of the Lamb. We're not going to need any kind of source of light because God provides everything we need. All right, anything through verse 23? Yes.
Back for a second, that in the temple, right? It was representative of the presence of God.
Yep.
On earth. Look here, this is God's presence everywhere. You don't need something representing that, or he comes and goes.
Right.
This is where he is.
Absolutely. Yep. There is no going out or coming in. You're there. Yeah. All right, verse 24. The nations of those who are saved shall walk in its light, and the kings of the earth bring their glory and honor into it. So notice this city is being described as this place that's prepared for the people of God. The nations and the kings, these aren't literal nations or kings in that sense. It's people that have been saved from all the nations over the course of human history. All the people who are faithful to the Lord from the beginning of time is what's being described here. The kings of earth bring their glory and honor into it. It's a really strange phrase, and it can be taken one of two ways. Either literal kings, you could talk about David, Solomon. Okay, certainly there's that sense of that glory and honor that they have in the flesh as king. But it would be a strange thing to consider physical kingship as something to be brought into a place that is spiritual. And it kind of makes me think back to the fact of the promise that Jesus gave, that those who overcome, he will give to us to sit on his throne, just as the Father gave to him to sit on the Father's throne. And it kind of makes me wonder if this kings and the nations, certainly there's that imagery of all those who are saved, and certainly the sense of glory and honor that's coming with it. But ultimately, kings on the earth, are we going to necessarily, in heaven, am I going to be of any lesser value or lesser status than King David? No. We're all going to be the same. We're all going to be equal. There's not going to be one who's greater or lesser. It's God and then us. And so it kind of makes you think about what's being described here. It's being described as that from all the earth, everyone who's saved will go to heaven. And it's that glory and honor that is being attributed to us, given to us. Not that we've earned, but given to us because of the promise of God to those who overcome. Verse 25, its gates shall not be shut at all by day. There shall be no night there. Which means, when will the gates be shut? Never. Okay? Never. And that speaks directly again to this complete lack of fear, complete lack of danger or threat of any kind. Because you shut the gates to prevent enemies from coming in at night. You shut the gates to prevent wild animals, predators to come in at night. But there's not going to be any night. There's nothing to be afraid of, or of which to be afraid. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick with verse 26 on through verse 27. That'll be the end of chapter 21. We'll cover our questions next week. And Lord willing, we'll begin chapter 22 as well next Sunday. Again, those notes are on the back table and in your emails. Thank you.